Hello everybody, it's Keith Tanner here from Flyin Miata, and I am here to speak to you today about the fundamentals of forced induction. Miatas and forced induction have a long history. The first turbo Miata showed up pretty much instantly. The Miata engine, the NA engine, has a history in other forced induction applications, and there's been boost added to Miatas ever since. Flyin Miata actually got their start because Bill Cardell bought a Miata in 1989, put on a turbo kit 1,800 miles later, and he was the only person who could get it to work, and therefore the manufacturer sent everybody his way. And that's how Flyin Miata effectively got started, was doing tech support on someone else's turbo kit. So we've been involved in turbos for a long time, turbos and Miatas, forced induction Miatas. We've sold just about every kind of forced induction there is for the car. We sold Sebring Superchargers when they were Sebrings. We sold them when they were Jackson Racing Superchargers. We've sold M62s, all sorts of different options. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about what forced induction is, what the different types are, and then, so basically educate you in the fundamentals of this. I'm not going to spend it talking about very hardcore, fine little details, such as, I apologize to whoever asked this question, what turbo to use on a time attack K24 swapped Miata with a non-sleeved block. As much as I'd love to answer that question, one, I'm not the guy to answer that question. And two, I think we're going to make this a little more general. We're going to talk about, what is forced induction, why do you want it, and how do the various types differ. So, what is forced induction? Basically, the way you make power in an internal combustion engine is by exploding things, fuel and air. And you can only explode so much fuel before you need more oxygen. Well, it's more of a controlled burn than an explosion, but it's more fun to call it an explosion. So the more oxygen you can ram in the cylinder, in the combustion chamber, the more fuel you can put in there, the bigger bang you get, and the bigger you bang, the more your power. So the best way to get more air in there is to simply physically ram it in there. There's all sorts of things you can do with naturally aspirated engines to improve flow through the engine, to improve extraction with the header, better intake, stuff like this, but honestly, the easy way to do it is just plain ram the air in there, don't give it a choice. And that's what forced induction is. You are forcing in the intake charge. So there's several different kinds of forced induction. I have a few of them laid out on the table in front of me here. I'm going by notes here because you can imagine, I want to make sure I get this right. We have superchargers. This is an example of a supercharger here. This is a positive displacement supercharger. You've got turbochargers, which of course most people are very familiar with and very, very popular from Miata, so we have a turbocharger. And we also have centrifugal superchargers, which is sort of a combination of the two, and I'll get to those in a bit. But those are the three basic types of forced induction you're going to have with a Miata. Positive displacement turbocharger or supercharger, a turbocharger, which is technically a turbo supercharger, but nobody really says that, and the centrifugal supercharger. So let's talk about how they work. This is probably the easiest one to understand, the positive displacement supercharger. This is a root style, and you can look down the end here, you can see what happens. This is driven off a belt on the front of the engine. As the engine turns, it turns this thing like an alternator or power steering pump, and this is literally a blower. It is basically, it just pumps air out of this, well actually that's the intake, isn't it? It comes in here, gets pumped through this intercooler, and then into the engine. But that's what this thing is just basically a pump. There's a slightly different variant that actually compresses the air as it goes. I'll get to that in a minute. But this is the fundamentally supercharger. Very easy to understand. A lot of people think it's easy to do because you can look at it and you can see, okay, it's got a belt, also on the side of the engine. Air goes in here, it comes out there, and it goes. There's some pitfalls to this. You've got to be very careful with that belt alignment. The belt carries a lot of power, so you've got to make sure that the belt is tensioned well and well wrapped. There's a bunch of little pitfalls, but fundamentally it's very easy to understand. Turbochargers are a little different. They are almost power for free, because that's the way you think of them at first. Turbocharger is made of two different parts. One part is this turbine, and you can see what's going on here. This is attached to the exhaust manifold of the engine, so all the exhaust from the engine comes in to the intake on the turbine. It spins as a turbine wheel that's in there, and then dumps out the exhaust. So you've got all this exhaust that you're creating, byproduct combustion, it's got pressure behind it, and you're using that to spin basically a shaft inside here. On the other side of the shaft, you've got a compressor.
and there's this little wheel in here is attached to the other side of that turbine wheel, and that spins it, and this is effectively a fan, a compressor. It sucks air in the middle, spins it around, and then pops it out. This is the outlet here. We've got it packed off in this car. Dumps it in here and then into the engine. That's what does the compression. So it seems like money. It seems like you're getting something for nothing because you were getting rid of that exhaust anyway. There's a few costs to that, but effectively that's what a turbocharger is. Centrifugal is kind of a weird marriage of the two. Centrifugal takes the belt drive from a supercharger and the compressor from a turbocharger and gets rid of the turbine. So basically, instead of having a turbine on here, it spins this. It spins the shaft using a belt. There's usually a gearbox in there because these things will reach speeds of over 100,000 RPM. So you've really got to crank it up. But that's effectively what a centrifugal is. It's a belt-driven turbocharger. Easiest way to look at it. And that is the fundamentals of it. There's one other part that's important, and it's important for all of them, and that is when you compress air, it gets hot. This is high school physics right there. Was it PV over RT, I think, is the equation for that? But you compress air, it's going to get hot, and you want it to be as cool as possible and as dense as possible when it goes in the engine. So for that, we have intercooling or charge cooling. So we will take the hot air that's coming out of the turbo or the hot air coming out of the supercharger, and we will do something to cool it down before it goes in the engine in almost all situations. The easiest way to do it on a turbocharger is an air-to-air intercooler. It basically looks like a radiator, but it's got air coming in one side and out the other, and it cools down the charge. Superchargers can use those, or they can use an air-to-water, which is basically a radiator that works in reverse. You put cool water through this radiator, and the air going through it cools down, transfers the heat to the cool water in the radiator, the heat exchanger, and then it goes into the engine. And that is the fundamentals of what we're dealing with here. Is you've got something to pack air, or just blow it through, and then you've got something to cool it down again, and then you add fuel to it and set it on fire, bang, wheel spin, and everyone has a good time. There is one interesting difference on these two, and I'm concentrating mostly on these two types of forced induction, because that's what you see most. Centrifugal, when it's like one or the other, I'll let you know. But one thing that's different is the location of the throttle body. Now see, this thing is a pump. This is going to run, when the engine's turning, it's going to move that air no matter what. And you can figure out, basically every time this one turns, this is a 62 cubic inch. So every time it rotates, it moves 62 cubic inches of air. And so you can, faster you spin it, the more air gets moved. But it's always going to move that air. So you've got to have the throttle body before the supercharger, because the throttle body, of course, what's restricting the air in the engine a little bit. That's what helps you control your power output. And so this thing, it sucks through the throttle body. The turbocharger leaves the throttle body in the stock location because this is a fan. It doesn't have to make boost if it doesn't want to. It makes boost in relative to load. The more exhaust gas you have going through here, the more boost you make. So this thing, when the throttle is closed, it's not producing boost, not trying to break down the door. So the throttle body stays in stock location. And the interesting thing that happens there is that one, the throttle body, the volume of air involved in intercooling doesn't affect the location of the throttle body. So that's actually good for throttle response because you've got a small throttle volume. Everything happens quickly. It also means you can run this big, crazy air-to-air intercooler without really affecting too much. These things, because the throttle body is before the supercharger, all of the plumbing for the supercharger is behind the throttle body. So if you open the throttle or close the throttle, you've got to wait for that pressure for the air to make its way through the entire system before something happens, which is why you often see superchargers built into an intake manifold to keep this volume as small as possible. And that also means you've got an interesting little problem in that superchargers are sucking atmospheric pressure. So if you're trying to pull all of your horsepower to a throttle body the size of a stock one, this thing's trying to pull, say, twice as much air, and it's still trying to go through the same size hole. So superchargers will benefit from a larger throttle because, again, they're trying to suck through that. The turbochargers and the centrifugals, in this case, they're pumping pressurized air through that. So they might be running, say, 15 psi. They've got twice as much pressure going through that hole, so they can move twice as much air through that hole. So you don't need to worry about a larger throttle body in quite the same way as you do with the supercharger. You can put a throttle body after the supercharger and not before, but it makes the most unholy noise you've ever heard in your life. It screams, and you've also got to make sure you don't explode all of your intercooler piping and all of your intake piping when you close the throttle. You need a blow-off valve the size of your head. It can be done technically. very challenging to do well. Generally not done more than once. And usually with, people blowing the seams apart in the intercoolers and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm just rambling all over the place here. I do recommend that you ask questions. If you have questions, if something I didn't cover, I covered too fast, something you want to know, definitely ask them. I will respond to as many questions as I can. And Travis over there will let me know if there are any. Travis, do we have any questions?
Well, we have someone who's asking the differences between the FM full stage 1 kit versus putting together your own eBay kit. And I'm assuming they'd like benefits and comparisons. Okay. So if we want to touch on that later.
Yeah, what I will do is I'll get through the generic, the overall knowledge-based part of stuff, and then I'll start dealing with some of the Flyin Miata specific questions, because I know there's a lot of Flyin Miata specific questions. Okay, so another couple of differences between these fundamental things, and in this case, the centrifugal supercharger is over in the supercharger camp, and that is back pressure and knock and compression ratio and stuff like that. The turbo, because it's driving off the exhaust manifold, it's driving off the exhaust pressure. It's basically a restriction in your exhaust system, and so this is where that pressure doesn't come for that horsepower doesn't come from for free. The engine is having to work harder to push the exhaust out through this turbine and out of the tailpipe. So you have increased back pressure, which basically makes the car more prone to detonation, knocking. And you generally, if you're looking for maximum power, especially, you need to run less compression ratio, or you have to retard the ignition timing, or you have to run very high octane gasoline, or all of the above. So that is a downside to the turbochargers, that back pressure that they give. Superchargers don't have that back pressure because there's nothing on the exhaust side of the engine at all. And again, that's the same for the centrifugal. So they're not quite as prone to knock because of that. The downside is it takes power to turn that pump in here, and it can take double-digit levels of horsepower. That's a fairly big parasitic loss on the engine. So you do have a loss there, enough that you actually, when you're doing emissions testing on these things, you need to do idle tests on superchargers because the extra load in the engine can cause the engine to basically run dirtier. So when we're doing emissions testing on superchargers, we actually have to do more tests on the supers because of that. So the power doesn't come for free in either case, but that is one big difference when you're tuning an engine. Dealing with the supercharger versus turbo is dealing with the back pressure versus dealing with the belt drag as to how you're going to deal with that. Because that belt drag, especially on the positive displacements, superchargers are more prone to idle droop. You come up to a stop, you put the clutch in, just that extra drag of the blower will pull down the engine a bit. Now, I did mention there's a couple of different kinds of positive displacement superchargers. Oh, we do have a question? Yes, over there in the back.
How often are people running E85 or 105 octane on stock engine with forced inductions? I'm assuming to help eliminate the knock.
So octane is wonderful. Octane lets you do all sorts of stuff, and E85 is fantastic because it'll actually not only increase your octane, but it actually cools the intake charge as well. So if you've got it, turbos, forced induction cars love E85. Can't always find it. We used to play with it a lot at Flyin Miata until we unfortunately lost our local source for it. Makes the dyno room smell really nice too, actually. You can tell when someone's running a lot of corn juice. E85 definitely worth getting if you can get your hands on it. One thing you've got to watch though is that the ethanol content of E85 is not consistent. It can vary from anything from 70 to I think over 85. I think it's maximum 85%. But if you tune your car to the edge of destruction, assuming you got 85% ethanol, and then you get a tank full of 70%, well, then you find out the edge of destruction is on the wrong side, and well, then things get expensive. So yeah, E85 is great, especially if you have the tuning, the sensors. Your ECU can compensate for it, measure the actual ethanol content, and then fine tune accordingly. Wonderful stuff if used correctly. So, two different kinds of positive relation superchargers. There is the classic root style, which is what this is, which is basically, it's a pump. It doesn't pressurize things, doesn't pressurize the air, it just moves air, and then the pressure comes from basically the air backing up into the intake system because it's got nowhere to go. The other kind is a twin screw, and they're not as common on Miatas. There have been a couple of people who have built twin screw. Kenny Bell built one for the NB years ago. Flyin Miata had them called the Supercharger for the NA and the NB. I don't think anybody, there was the auto rotor way back in ancient history. I don't think anybody is currently selling a twin screw. Twin screws are a little more efficient. I'll get to efficiency in a moment. A little more efficient than the root style at full throttle. They tend to be a little bit more expensive because they're built to different tolerances. They're much more complicated inside. It's a great piece. We found with the Superchargers in particular that we had to run them right at the ragged edge. To get the maximum performance out of them, we had to run them right close to their maximum speed, and so they worked great until they didn't. Because you had bearing problems at that point. But the big difference is that the twin screw compresses air inside the actual supercharger, so compressed air is coming out instead of just a lot of air, and that does make it more efficient overall. Again, it's an unusual thing to find in a Miata these days. They're pretty cool, but just not that common. Go back to my notes. Okay, now what limits power on these things? Why can't you just keep ramming more and more boost in? Well, first off, let's get to how the boost is controlled on these things. Positive displacement supercharger, it is simply about how fast you spin the blower. And that is simply about changing belts, changing pulleys. It's all done in gear ratios, basically. If you've got this thing set up so it turns 2 times for every time the engine goes over, you get 1 level of boost. If you make it so it turns 3 times every time the engine turns over, you'll get 50% more boost. It's purely done with the belt. These things are a lot more interesting. So let's kind of zoom in here, Travis. This is the wastegate. This thing, and this is supposed to be attached down. It's not on this one, but this little door opens up and allows the exhaust gases that we're spinning the turbine to bypass the turbine. And basically, it spills all that energy. It doesn't open this far, but you can see it. So that's a wastegate, and this is how a turbo controls its boost. Is that the wastegate actuator? This little thing I'm holding in my hand. It's got a little diaphragm in it, and it's got a big spring too. Based on the amount of boost pressure being put in here, it will open and close this. It works a little closed loop system. It will open and close and maintain that right at its spring pressure. And you can also mess with the signal going in here. That's where electronic boost controllers and manual boost controllers come in. But that's basically what it comes down to. You put, say, 8 pounds of boost in here. This thing opens up, spills off boost until you get back down to 8, and then closes up again. And it's very organic, very analog. Opens and closes, and maintains the boost level right where you want it, which makes it very easy to adjust the boost level on a turbo. You bleed off some of the signal, you change the pretension on this preload on the spring, you move back and forth a little bit, you can easily add more boost with a turbo, which is one of its strengths and one of its disadvantages, because it's very easy to say, well, it didn't blow up at 12, so I'm going to turn it up to 14. You turn up to 15, and you turn up to 18, and then you finally find out where it does blow up, but unfortunately there's no way to go backwards from there, so... This is why you sometimes find out the turbos have a reputation for blowing up engines, because it's so easy just to add more boost, and so people do. Yeah, it's often a lesson you have to learn the hard way, unfortunately. Find a safe limit, don't mess with it, stop trying to find out more, because you will eventually find the limits, and that's an expensive limit to find. It's not the turbo that'll suffer. So, there we get into engine management. Because these things are ramming so much more air in here, into the engine, because they're ramming so much, they need so much more fuel, you need something to add that extra fuel. And you also, if you're dealing with a lot of boost, you may have to pull the timing back as well. So there's a couple ways you can do this. One is you can simply add various piggyback systems that let the stock ECU do what it needs to do when you're out of boost. And when you're in boost, it will add fuel, or it will pull timing, or it will modify different sensors. That's how our Voodoo box works, and that is the easiest way to get through emissions, honestly, because it allows you to use all that very finely tuned stock ECU tuning in all the difficult parts of engine management, of emissions tuning, which is the cold start and the idle and the AC compensation. But there are limits. That has to work with the stock injectors. You can only push so far, and that's why the Stage 1 turbo kits that we sell, for example, that's where their power limits come from. That's what the injectors can handle. If you want to go further than that, you end up basically making the car into a factory turbocharged or supercharged car, and by that you either reprogram the stock computer, which is what's done on the NCs and NDs, or you replace the stock computer, which is done on the NA and the NB. And then you can fine-tune the fuel maps, you can fine-tune the ignition levels, you can even have closed-loop behavior on the boost control on these things. That's where you can deal with E85. You can have all sorts of extra complexity, but you are now responsible for everything the car does. It's a lot more complicated to set up. It sounds easy on the forums. Turns out that the first 80% is easy, and the last 20% takes 90% of the work, and that's the stuff that makes it hard to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So be aware if you are going into the aftermarket engine management field that it's not something you just throw on a weekend and you're done. It does take a lot of work to tune it. Do we have a question in the back?
We've got a couple of interesting things, and I'm going to paraphrase here, so I'm going to apologize to the question askers in advance. So first off, we had a little mini conversation going on in here asking if E85 will hurt the stock engine components or if you have to replace a lot of stuff to be able to use E85.
Okay, that's a good one.
And then now they're popping up so fast I can't read them.
I figured this would be a popular topic of conversation.
Someone was asking on an MB2 if it would be better in the long run for 180 to 200 horsepower to just swap in the Mazda MSM engine and modify that, or to start with a standard MB2 and use our turbo kit. What would be the more cost-effective, I think was his term.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm paraphrasing, so I apologize.
We'll table that one for now. I will get to that. We'll get to the very specific, Miata-specific questions in a minute. I'll try to remember that. Remind me of that one if I forget. E85 and underhood stuff. That's a legit question. E85 it can dissolve certain kinds of rubber. It can dissolve certain kinds of fuel lines or degrade them internally. I would recommend, if you are planning on running E85, make sure, one, that your fuel pump is compatible with it, because it lives in a sea. It is immersed in the fuel. Make sure all of the hoses inside your tank are also E85 compatible. And also any rubber or flexible fuel lines in your system should be E85 compatible if at all possible. There's not really very many of them, honestly. There's a couple on top of the tank. There's a couple running to the fuel rail. In this NB here, there's only one running to the fuel rail. You can't see, of course, because everything's buried deep inside. But I would recommend, it's good practice to make sure that all of your fuel parts are E85 compatible. It's not an immediate failure problem. What happens is things just degrade faster than they should. So I would recommend, especially, honestly, if you're turbocharging, say, an NB like this one. The NBs were last made in 2005. They're 15 years old. Putting a set of new fuel lines in a 15-year-old car, not a terrible idea. So I would recommend. Newer cars tend to be more ethanol tolerant because the percentage of ethanol and pump gas has been changing over the years. On an NA or NB, I would probably change all the fuel lines just because, again, it's good practice at this sort of that sort of age of the car. It's a good idea to do. Travis, we have another question.
Oh, someone was asking, and to paraphrase, when and how a turbocharger should make boost. He's saying that one of our turbo kits is only making boost under load, and he didn't know if it should be making boost all the time when the engine revs or only when it's under load.
That's an excellent segue, because the next thing on my list is boost characteristics. So let's talk about boost characteristics. And I'll start with a turbocharger. Turbochargers only make boost in response to load. That is true. You need that high pressure exhaust gas basically coming through here to spin this thing up. So yeah, if you free rev a turbo engine, you're going to see little or no pressure on the boost gauge, because there's just nothing for it to basically work against. There's no load on the thing at all. So that is completely normal on a turbo kit. Now see, turbos, they're a very efficient way to compress air to. This is a very efficient little housing, kind of cool looking things actually. You can look at this one, yeah, in a way. But they don't really start working because they're effectively a fan. They don't start working until they're up to a certain speed. You need, it's kind of a little catch-22. You need that exhaust gas to make the boost, but as you make more boost, you get more exhaust gas. And so the ability of the thing to generate boost climbs as you work the engine harder. So you get into what's called turbo lag, which is the time between putting your foot down and then having that enough exhaust energy to get to the boost level you're looking for. And that can be extreme, or it can be very, very short. There's a whole bunch of factors that come into play there. Compression ratio of the engine is a big one. A high compression engine has a lot more exhaust energy. It will be able to spin up a turbo faster. Downside, more prone to detonation. If you have a very low restriction exhaust after the turbo, say, no catalytic converter in it or just a little dump tube, there'll be more pressure differential, and we've been talking about pressure differentials a lot in this series. That'll be able to spin this thing up faster. The more ignition timing you can run, again, the more exhaust energy you've got, the faster it will spool. The smaller the turbo, the faster it spools up, because there's less inertia in it. there's a lot involved in this. Turbo sizing is a major, major aspect to turbocharging a car well, and part of that is determining what you want those characteristics to be. Putting on, if you want to make 450 horsepower and run 9.25, you're going to need a big turbo. You're going to give up response to do that because that big turbo is going to be a little more sluggish to get itself up and running, at least up to full boost. If you want very, very high response, but at the expense of upper end power, then you can go with a smaller turbo because you'll be able to get to your maximum boost quicker. And Jeremy is probably sitting at home right now pulling his hair out because he maintains there's no such thing as turbo lag, that a big turbo will make the same boost level by a certain time as a small turbo, which you can prove. It does show up on the dyno charts and then on the data log, but the big turbo keeps going, so it feels like you're not there yet. You don't have full power. You might have your 6 PSI, but you don't have full power. So it's a big concern. A lot of people are convinced that turbos have this bad lag characteristic. With old school turbos back in the day when we were doing blow-through carburetors on Corvairs, yeah, it was a problem. With modern engine management, with modern turbos, with ball bearings, and in some cases twin scrolls, it's much less of a problem. On the ND, it's amazing how fast, and I'll talk about the ND a little more later, it's amazing how responsive this thing is because of that very high compression engine, because of just the way that the amount of control you have over the engine management on that car. Superchargers, positive displacement superchargers, in an ideal world, and I'm only going to talk about ideal stuff here right now, will make the exact same level of boost at idle as they do at full redline, because their ratio of the amount of air they move to the number of times to the engine speed is fixed. So every time the engine turns over, it gets so much air. So this, in theory, in a perfect world, has complete maximum boost available at all engine speeds at all time. The centrifugal is kind of an interesting case. Centrifugal is kind of a weirdo one because its power speed, oh dear, it's the speed of the compressor is directly related to engine speed. So the characteristics of a centrifugal supercharger is that boost level is directly related to engine speed. So say if you've got 12 pounds of boost at 6,000 RPM, you've got half that boost available at 3,000 RPM. Makes for a very distinctive driving characteristic. If you're up in your red line all the time, it's got all the boost all the time, but it ramps up in kind of the first few times you drive on kind of an odd way. It's the way the car, it feels like a highly tuned naturally aspirated engine. The harder you rev it, the harder it pulls, and it just pulls harder and harder and harder. It's a linear power curve, but it's very, very biased towards the top end. So it can be a little strange to drive on the street because of that. If you're not near red line, you don't have anywhere near the boost level you want, but they're very popular for track use because they have that high, they've got the efficiency of a turbo, and you're probably spinning the engine pretty fast anyway. Now, I said that was in a perfect world. In this messy world we live in, we have physics to deal with, we have inefficiencies. And this blower has to be moving fast enough to actually sort of seal itself internally and start pumping air. I'm doing this right now. There's almost no air moving out through these ports. I'm just turning it slowly. If I was able to attach this to, say, an impact gun and spin it, I'd get some serious flow through here. But, when it's moving slowly, it doesn't move that much. So in reality, you don't get 12 pounds or 6 pounds, whatever, boost at idle. You've got to get this up to speed before it really starts pumping the air. Turbos, of course, you've got all those weird interactions. And the centrifugals, they're pretty much, as I described, they're pretty linear in that because they're not trying to make boost down near idle. You don't notice the fact that they're inefficient, that they're not doing it yet. And turbo sizing, again, there's all sorts of, again, I'm not the guy to talk about this, all sorts of compressor maps and efficiency maps and things you can look at to find out where the most efficient range is, because inefficiency is heat. And as you compress that air, as you beat that air up, you start making it hotter and hotter. And if you're outside of the efficiency range of the turbo or the supercharger, you're going to find your intake air temperature shoot up, your back pressure gets high, and then you have detonation problems. Because that's really what limits the power in these things, is detonation. You get to the point where you have to keep pulling back timing because you're turning into a diesel, you're blowing up your air-fuel charge on its own. And that's very destructive on the internals of the engine. So you've got to stay below that threshold. That is usually what limits your power, ultimate power on a turbo or on a supercharger, is that limit of detonation. And if you get a small turbo and you spin it too fast, everything's too hot, too much back pressure, you're going to detonate far earlier than with a big turbo. It's not working as hard. So it's fun. In the real world, it's not as easy as it should be. We have a question over there.
We got a few little questions.
Okay.
We'll start off with, are there benefits for tuning for turbine speeds? And is it better to use an electronic boost controller or add a speed sensor to the ECU?
Wow. So actually tuning on turbine speed, my brain's not big enough to answer that question. This is more of a fundamentals thing. I'm not a turbo expert. I know the basic theory on this stuff. If you want to start talking about turbine speeds, I'm not really the guy to answer that question. So I'm going to punt on that and say, I don't know. That's a good question. I'd love to know that answer. In reality, trying to find a speed sensor, a tachometer for your turbo, it's a pretty unusual thing to have access to. So most people don't tune towards it. So we've talked about the theoretical advantage of each of these things, the theoretical disadvantage of each thing. So which one is the best one? Everyone wants to know, I want to run on track, I want to run autocross. And everyone's convinced, like their dad swears by superchargers, their dad swears by turbochargers. You grew up in the import Honda world, you grew up in your Vin Diesel, the Fast and Furious, you blew up with a big blower sticking through the hood of your Charger. The reality is, it's whichever one is implemented better. That's what really matters. The fundamental technology behind it starts to disappear behind the implementation. You can get into very subtle differences, but the fact of the matter is that a very well integrated or very well implemented turbo will have more bottom end, will be less laggy, more responsive than a poorly integrated implemented supercharger, and sort of vice versa. A well implemented supercharger can make more horsepower, can have cooler intake temps and everything than a poorly done turbo. So it's really all about how well it's done. And one of the questions that we get a lot at Flyin Miata is, we've sold turbos over the years, we've sold supers over the years, we sold very, very few centrifugals, although we've tested multiple different types, some which went to market, some which didn't. Why do we use one over the other? And it almost always comes down to the implementation. We've been happy with the implementation of the turbos. The turbos that we sell for the NA and the NB have undergone a couple of decades of fine-tuning. The current generation debuted in 2006, and they're based on previous work. But the current iteration started in 2006, and all the changes since then have been little iterations, little improvements here, little improvements there. So it's a very, very well developed system. So it's very well implemented by this point, because we've been able to respond to things that weren't working well, things that could be better. We've evolved them quite a bit over the years. The superchargers on those, we weren't as happy with. The ones that we've dealt with, we weren't as happy with their response, their power levels, for various reasons. Their effects on drivability, which is kind of a weak point in the NA and NB already. They already have idle droop problems. Their air intake temperatures, what that meant. So that's why on that platform we've come back to turbos over and over again. On the NC, we were actually working on a centrifugal setup back in 2006. And then Cosworth announced this cool this cool root space system that they were going to come to market with. It was engineered by Magnuson. Cosworth just basically paid to put their name on it. It took forever to come to market, but it was such a nicely implemented piece of kit that it didn't matter if it was a turbo or supercharger. It was just really, really well done. And so that's why we went with superchargers on that platform. This kit, unfortunately, is no longer with us. The manufacturer, Magnuson, they're the guys who actually produced the kit. We kept it alive after Cosworth walked away from it. We kept on buying them, kept on bringing them to the shelf. Unfortunately, it's an older generation kit. Like, this thing is 15 years old by this point. The manufacturer is not as interested in making them as they used to be. They've raised the minimums to them to the point where it's simply not economic, unfortunately, for us to offer them. So we are looking at options. We will have another boosted NC option. We are working on a couple of different things right now. I can't tell you a whole lot more than that, but don't worry, NC owners, we will have an answer for you again. It may not look like this, because of simply the barrier to entry on this particular setup has become a little excessive, but we will have something. The ND, and this is an ND turbo, it's an interesting case, because we did sell both the popular Edelbrock supercharger and the BBR turbo. BBR has been involved in turbocharged Miatas since the early 90s, just like we have. They actually sold some on factory dealerships through Mazda UK back in 1991, I think it was, to celebrate Mazda's win at Le Mans. So they've been in the game for a long time. So it makes sense that we would team up with them. This is their turbo kit. we sold both this and the Edelbrock Supercharger side by side. And this is a really interesting case because of that super high compression. This is a really big turbo for the amount of power we're making. So because of that high compression, there's lots and lots of energy to spin up that turbine. It can spin up a big turbo faster than you think. And the big turbo has very low outlet temperatures because it's not really working very hard. And so therefore, again, that high compression, we can run a lot of the timing, which spins up the turbo really fast. So it's an extremely responsive setup. It's like the least turbocharged feeling car you've ever driven. We've actually had journalists say exactly that when driving the car. They can't believe how drivable, how smooth it is. It's nowhere near the typical aftermarket big laggy turbo that's mostly done for dyno bragging rights. The supercharger on that setup had very different characteristics. It was one of Edelbrock's or one of, I guess, Magnuson's probably, 4 rotors or 4 lobe setups, more efficient design than this one. But it needed to spin up to a certain speed in order to really start moving air. So this was the big torque monster. We could affect the torque curve with this thing. We could run a little more boost down low. We could fine tune the VVT to spin up the turbo fast. And we found that we could get a lot more torque out of this thing, a lot more low end. We had the response. And we just found the drivability overall. We prefer the drivability of the BBR, which is why we stopped carrying Edelbrock. Because mostly, you ask anybody at Flyin Miata, they've driven them both. I've driven them both on track, on street, and we just preferred this option. So that's why we decided, well, if we're not willing to recommend it to somebody, why would we sell it? So there we go. That's why we switched to a turbo on this particular platform, or decided to stick with the turbo on that particular platform. Oh, the centrifugal. There's kind of an interesting case with the centrifugal with the boost levels. I said that you can. The centrifugal, the boost level is directly related to engine speed, which it is, but there's a kind of a cool thing you can do. You can overspin it. You can spin it too fast and then put a big leak in it, basically recycle some of that pressure so that it overboosts at the top end and you leak it off, but that way you have more boost available down low. It's a complicated setup. You're wasting some energy doing that because you're heating the air up, moving it around, but it is a way to get more boost down low. I don't know how many people have actually implemented it. It's one of those things I think that is, and there's probably a kit on the market from somebody from this, I say this, but it's one of those things I think that is really kind of cool to talk about a theory, but the actual application, you have a bypass the size of, enormous bypass in order to deal with that, but it's kind of a fun theoretical thing to do. So which one do you want for autocross? Which one do you want for track use? Both. Again, implementation. The biggest problem superchargers have, because of that throttle to volume that they're dealing with, because of the response problem you get out of having an air-to-air intercooler on the supercharger, they almost always use air-to-water intercoolers. And this one has one in here. There's where the port's for. There we go. Here are the water lines that run in and out of here and exchange. It's got its own little radiator. There's cold water comes in here, gets heated up by the hot air from the supercharger, goes back out again. The problem is you can heat soak that eventually. You get you pump heat into that cooling water faster than you get rid of it. And so these things can start to have trouble on track simply for overheating. Their intake temps start going up, and then they start having more trouble with detonation. They start pulling timing out if you're properly instrumented. And so their performance will drop off because of that. So that's the biggest. You don't tend to see superchargers on purpose-built race cars. That's one big reason. Turbos, they can keep running at high boost for a long time. An air-to-air intercooler can get rid of a lot of hot air. The biggest problem you have with these things overall is you get a lot of heat right around on this intake manifold. The temperature in this thing can be 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. These can glow red simply because you've got all that exhaust energy, all that exhaust heat, and it's being hit on the hold back with this turbo. We actually have to use special fasteners, special locking fasteners. We use Inconel studs on some of our applications to keep these things together because of the sheer amount of heat involved going here. And you'll never see an aluminum exhaust manifold because it would melt. So the biggest problem you have with the turbochargers is basically just dealing with the heat. And because you've got that big air-to-air intercooler in front of the radiator, you're dumping heat into your other heat exchangers too, and so your radiator becomes less efficient. So heat management becomes more of an issue. You can get on top of that. This is the one that can keep running high power for a long period of time. The response part makes it a little less favored by the autocross guys. Autocross guys tend to go for superchargers. Again, it's about the implementation, but all else being equal, they'll often go with superchargers for that super lightning quick response. Turbo guys have a little more time to plan, or the track guys, and so tends to be the more preferred option for track usage. Again, gross generalizations there, but that is the overall. Those are the challenges of each of these on the track. The centrifugal is actually kind of in a good place for the track. It's got those. I think I don't like the drivability of a centrifugal supercharger on the street. I don't like the way that it ramps up power at a given throttle level, how it keeps going out on the street. On the track, it's got the advantages of a turbo in terms of the more efficient compressor. It can use an air-to-air intercooler, but it doesn't have the back pressure problem. So it's actually a pretty good choice for track use if all you're doing is track use and you're always up near the red line. Downside is if you find yourself in the wrong gear coming off the corner, whoops, that guy, or I had to cut the throttle because someone else was coming up the inside, and you find yourself a couple of thousand RPM down, you find you're down on boost too, and so it takes a moment to get back on top of the car, on top of the power curve. That's a drivability thing you have to deal with centrifugals, but they do have that advantage on track in that they have that cool air intake temps, but without the back pressure. So there you go. That's the oddball case of the centrifugal, and that's why they're often popular with track guys. Okay, emissions legality is something I want to talk about because Flyin Miata only sells emissions legal stuff. The EPA has made it so that it is not a good place. The U.S. is not a good place to be selling things that remove emissions components, and we live here in the world, so we don't want to keep polluting any more than we have to. So our stuff is emissions legal. That means we keep catalytic converters. That means we keep factory emissions programming, factory ECU programming for as much as possible. Even on our old Supercharger setup, we had an EO for that. The downside to that is that you are limited by certain factors. You can't change out the ECU for something else. You can't add extra knock protection, for example, that you might have had with an aftermarket ECU. You have to be a little more conservative with what you're doing. So if you want 400 horsepower, you're not going to do it with emissions legality. If you want to basically, add 60% to your power level with an emissions legal setup, that is quite possible. 30, 40, 50, 60. I forget the exact numbers, but depending on the platform, it is available to us. I'm just looking at the questions I've got here. Travis, do we have some questions?
We have 4 or 5 questions.
4 or 5 questions, okay.
Well, I'll start with an easy one. Do we calculate boost based on sea level atmospheric pressure or localized atmospheric pressure, and why?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. The case of high altitude, yeah, that is interesting. And that's one place where turbos and supers actually really set themselves apart. These things respond like naturally aspirated cars to altitude changes. And this is something living in Colorado is much, is important to us. Where we are right now, we've got about 18% less oxygen than you have down at sea level, which means we're down about 18% on power. Kind of sucks. We go higher, we lose even more. And unfortunately, with the superchargers, with this type of supercharger, because they are fixed to only a certain number of revolutions per engine, they're tied to engine speed, they can't adjust for that altitude. They can't spin faster as you climb. So, this thing, if we put this on an engine, it will be down 18% of power compared to sea level. Turbos, they run a closed loop system. They can adjust. They won't open that wastegate until they get to whatever your target boost is. So they can compensate. You can have a turbo that makes 6 pounds of pressure over, if you want, I can talk absolute kPa, but you can make sure you have the same absolute pressure in your intake manifold at sea level or at the top of Pikes Peak with a turbo, which is why, again, you go to Pikes Peak, you're going to see turbochargers, you're not going to see superchargers because they can't compensate. They get laggier. It takes a little bit longer to get the engine in there. The back pressure changes. There are trade-offs, but if you want to compensate for altitude, turbo is the way to do it. So do you express boost in terms of gauge pressure, or do you express it in terms of absolute pressure? And unless you live in Colorado, it's kind of basically the same thing. A boost gauge will show relative to ambient. So if you're at sea level and it shows 6 psi, and you come up here, it might only show 3, because we're down a couple psi from sea level up here on the supercharger. On the turbo, depending on if you're running electronic boost control that's referencing absolute pressure, or whether you're running a manual boost control that's simply delta over pressure, you might see different numbers. And it's a very important thing, especially when you're doing dyno testing. You can really get yourself tied in knots with this. When we talk about boost pressure, we are usually talking about what you see on the gauge. unless we'll talk about KPA absolute, which is what's actually in the manifold, the actual pressure in the manifold. But we usually talk about gauge pressure because that's the easiest thing to see. And we usually talk about sea level gauge pressure because honestly, unless you live in Colorado or you're lucky enough to live in another mountain state, they're basically the same thing. What is our next question, sir?
What impact does a lightened flywheel have on turbo response?
Interesting. What effect does a lightened flywheel have on turbo response? Very little, honestly. It has about the same effect it has on a naturally aspirated car. It's a change in the inertial, basically the inertia of the engine. It's mostly going to happen mostly going to show up in lower gears because that's where the change in engine speed is greatest. When you're in fifth gear and you floor the throttle, the change in engine speed is not that fast. It doesn't have a big effect. You do have to watch out for lightweight flywheels on supercharged cars with positive displacement blowers because they've got that drag from the pulley, from actually turning the blower. And that, as we mentioned earlier, can drag down the idle, and a lighter flywheel makes it easier for that to happen. So we don't recommend super light flywheels on supercharged cars for that reason. It has a tendency to exacerbate the idle droop problems. Turbos doesn't really have an effect at all. It's a separate question. So lightweight flywheels and turbos, happy.
Speaking of superchargers, do we know of a company that makes a blower that mounts on the bottom end of the intake manifold as opposed to the exhaust side? And does the Voodoo box work on superchargers or only turbos?
Well, that's several different questions. This is effectively a supercharger that goes on the bottom of the intake manifold. So the question is yes. The Edelbrock, I think, is built that way as well. They tend to sling them underneath. If you're talking about something off the shelf that lets you keep a factory exhaust manifold or intake manifold and hangs a supercharger into there, I've seen it done once or twice. The problem is that Mazda did things like put an alternator down there. So you got to figure out where to put your alternator. DIY level, it's not something very common at all. But yeah, usually when you see an all-in-one casting like this, when it's built into the intake manifold, it's generally slung underneath. As for the Voodoo box and superchargers, that's a good question actually, because the very, very quick response of superchargers can cause problems with the Voodoo box keeping up. And the Voodoo box does a couple of tricks to make sure you don't run lean on tip-in, which is, you're driving along and you slam the throttle open. You want to make sure you've got that fuel right away. The Voodoo box modifies the O2 sensor signal legally. I'd like to point out it's right in the EO. It modifies that O2 sensor signal to make sure you don't go lean at that point, and the stock ECU will respond, and then the Voodoo box starts adding fuel. But there's a very, very slight delay in that. It's enough that a supercharger will, especially on the NB2s, the VBT cars, will see a definite dip, a lean tip-in point, which can cause a little bit of a drivability problem. Not loudly problematic in terms of engine longevity or engine abuse, but that's the reason we generally don't recommend piggybacks for superchargers, at least not running any significant amount of boost. It is a problem. You can get ahead of the piggyback with the superchargers. So yeah, that's why, generally speaking, if you call us up, you can run a Voodoo box on a super. I have with a little M45 and a 1.6. I ran one for a while fairly successfully, but it's not the ideal setup. You can't run aftermarket engine management though. Maybe it's your only setup. We have another question there?
We have a few more. We have a couple more if you want them.
I'll bet we have questions.
How do we implement knock sensing and deterrent?
Knock sensing. This is important because you can hear knock to some extent, but you can't hear all knock, and that is the best way to destroy an engine with forced induction, is to let it knock, because that's when you start burning holes in pistons, you start bending rods. I probably have some destroyed pistons kicking around the shop here that's happened to. And these have knock sensors built into them. They're not super aggressive, but they have them. NCs and Ds have knock sensors. The ND computer is a very sophisticated piece of kit. You can actually do quite a bit with it. The NA cars are more of a problem. So you either have to tune it conservatively, retard the timing, run lots of fuel, run lots of octane, don't run too much boost, or you have to put on some sort of aftermarket ECU, which is, it's not something we work with these days, but a good aftermarket ECU, any reasonable aftermarket ECU, should have knock sensing built into it, and probably will have a couple of different levels of knock response. You might pull back a little bit of timing, might pull back a little bit more the next time, might go to a limp home map after that. But you would have to go to an aftermarket ECU to deal with actual knock sensing and response on the NAs, unfortunately. Mazda didn't have any reason to put a knock sensor on those things. It just wasn't, they're so low tuned from the factory, it wasn't really an issue.
What do you think of electric assisted turbos on Miatas?
Electric assisted turbos. I have a friend who's been working with those for years. Now, I think he's the head of hybrid development at McLaren, something like that. He worked at Mercedes in their hybrid system on their Formula One cars, and it's been working well for him. The power's got to come from somewhere. You've got to have a fair bit of power for it to make a difference. You can only, I think really the intent of those things is to fill in the bottom end, to fill in that little hole when you first tip in. Interesting idea. You can't run sustained boost with them, so it's very much a street setup, or maybe an autocross setup. You've got enough battery power to sort of make your way through it. Wouldn't work for sustained high performance driving because basically you can't replenish the battery fast enough. Power doesn't come for free. You've got to load up the engine to recharge those batteries. But it's a really interesting little concept. I don't have a lot of direct experience with that, unfortunately. The concept is good. Can it be implemented as an aftermarket part instead of being built into the fundamentals of the engine? I think Mazda might be doing it with the Skyactiv X, perhaps. That's a different question. I don't know how well it's been implemented on the Miatas.
One more?
Yeah, sure. Give me one more, and I'll look to see what else I've missed in here.
How much power, forced induction, can you throw at a stock engine before you have to basically build it? And that's paraphrasing, but I think that gets the point across.
How much power can it make? On the NAs and MBs, on the 1.8 cars, reliably, you can expect a bottom end to stand about 250 horsepower at the wheels for decades. We have a customer who put his turbo on in 1991. Milli Vanilli was in the top of the charts. He still has that car. It has over 500,000 miles on it now. He broke the clutch pedal in half at 300,000. I think he had the head done a year or two ago. So the head was in the 400,000 mile range. It's a great story. I got lost about exactly what the question was. With good engine management, well-tuned engine management, 250 horsepower is a sustainable power level. On the later cars, on the NCs, we unfortunately hit the limits of this blower before we really hit the limits of the engine. So when these things, we were in the low 200, 225, 230, 240 in that range, reliably in the stock 2-liter. The ND, there have been, the guys at BBR have done some testing. They have found that the rods become the weak point once you start pushing too much beyond where, the 200 horsepower, rear wheel horsepower, where we are with the BBR turbos right now. So sustained long-term use above that, I would be concerned. That is a very optimized engine, very lightweight inside. There's your question. The older the engine, the stronger it is, basically, because back when they designed the BP, they didn't have the same tools they had to optimize the engine and shave every gram that they have now. So they just threw a bunch of iron at it, and it's strong little bugger underneath. So good engine management, 250 on an NA and NB. Bad engine management, far less. So it's got to be tuned well. It's got to have, got to feed good fuel, and you've got to make sure you've got the knock sensors and everything you need in there to make sure that it stays healthy in case something goes wrong. So I did actually have questions on here on, that's a good segue into what you need to do to prepare for forced induction. Basically, your engine has to be healthy. It shouldn't need, for those sort of power levels, you shouldn't need to do anything exotic to the engine. Just make sure that it's got decent compression. Make sure, if it's got a leaky valve cover gasket, putting 8 pounds of boost down its throat is not going to fix the valve cover gasket. So get up on the maintenance. Make sure the engine is healthy. If it's got blow-by problems, it will not get better with blow-by. You will effectively have to rebuild the engine a little bit sooner probably because of that. But in terms of fundamental work, you shouldn't have to get inside a Miata engine to prepare it for boost. If you're planning on large amounts of boost over those numbers we just talked about, at that point you're looking at stronger rods. Might as well do pistons when you're in there, but really it's the rods you're looking for. And you can start looking at some of the supporting modifications, beef up the oil coolers, make sure you've got that ECU with the proper engine management, big injectors, big fuel pump. There's all sorts of stuff has to get addressed once you start going past the limits of the stock engine. But if you've got a car with 200,000 miles on it and it's a healthy engine, go ahead, try it. Nothing spectacular is liable to happen as long as you approach it intelligently. Just remember that oil is very low octane, so if you are burning oil, you are going to have knock problems. So if you're burning oil, definitely deal with that before you go with forced induction, because it will exaggerate any non-problems that would have. Now, we went back a while back. We had a question about whether we should use a Mazda Speed. Was it a Mazda Speed engine or Mazda Speed engine and turbo setup?
They said Mazda Speed setup and transplant, basically, or a stock 1.8 with our turbo kit.
The Mazda Speed was a very easy car to get easy power out of. You could bring a Mazda Speed up to 200 horsepower at the wheels with minimal modifications. So it was very popular for that. Pushing beyond that is difficult. The problem is that the Mazda Speed factory turbo is a weird combination of being laggy and small. A lot of back pressure, low power. So it's not an ideal turbocharger. If you're starting from scratch, it's not a great turbo to start with, because if you're trying to go anywhere past 200, it hits a wall pretty much immediately. It's got some weird plumbing too. You pretty much need an NB2 to have access to some of the holes in the body that are required for the intercooler plumbing. The engine itself, there's nothing special about the engine. It's basically just a 99-2000 engine. It's got the 9-to-1 compression, no VVT. It does have coil on plugs. It's the only thing that makes it different, really, other than a couple of small little details. But unless you've managed to come across a great takeout Mazda Speed engine, and you get it for a really good price, and you're a bit of a fabricator because you can deal with things like the weird oil-cooled plumbing, it's not something I would go after. It would be much easier to simply take a Flyin Miata Stage 1 turbo kit, bolt it right on there, and you're good to go. I say that my own personal street Miata is a 1990 with a Mazda Speed engine, but an FM2 turbo system, a Flyin Miata turbo system bolted on the side. I just basically use the Mazda Speed engine as a good, healthy NB engine, and then I took care of all the turbocharging stuff myself. I think that's the way to go. I'll look to see if I missed any questions here. You see if I missed any questions on your side there, Travis. Lots of questions on here. Will downpipes work with this? Will the FM manifold and downpipes work with the GT28 series turbo? The 2560 that we use on our turbo kits is a GT28, so the answer is yes. There's one question if there's any revisions coming for the NA8 carb legal turbo. It's a very specific question. I have a feeling I know what year that particular person has. There's a limit to what we can do. Once we have our EO, once we have our emissions executive order, there's a limit to how much we can do. We are talking to the ARB over in California about some small changes. Nothing significant, but we should be able to add things like a timing retard box, which will allow you to run a little more base timing, a little more response, a little cleaner emissions, which we're very interested in. Off boost, that will be coming down the road, and it will be something that will be available to upgrade for all those out there who are running our emissions legal Stage 1 turbos. Gross modifications in terms of, are you going to change the turbo size, or are you going to come up with some tubular manifold, are you going to mount the turbo on top of the hood, whatever, stuff like that. There's a limit to what we can do by the letter of the law, and also it's a very, very evolved kit, so it's unlikely we're going to touch the fundamentals. So there will be constant tweaks, going from a 2-piece throttle body inlet to a 1-piece throttle body inlet. Stuff like that's happening all the time. Gross changes, massive changes, unlikely to happen at this point. Why don't you see the M45 anymore? Well, this is where it gets in the implementation. The M45 was the original supercharger for the Miata back in, it must have been right around 1990. I think it was known as the Downey Atlanta Supercharger, then it was known as the Sebring Supercharger, then it was known as the Jackson Racing Supercharger, and I think it might have been known as the Moss Supercharger for a while. That thing got handed around. But that kit was originally designed for packaging reasons. It was a pretty small blower. It was a 45cc blower, and it was designed to run 6 psi on a 1.6 liter car, and it was perfectly sized for that. And then the 1.8 came out, and so we put it on there, but that thing's more than 10% bigger, so it needed to move that much more air. And then people wanted more boost, and so we started selling big boost kits for them. And what happened is we hit the level of efficiency almost immediately. And it got to the point where you'd spin the thing faster and make an extra 3 pounds of boost and make the exact same horsepower, because you had to pull out so much timing to keep it from knocking its little brains out that there was nowhere to go. So the problem with the M45 kit, with the advantage, is it was so close to being the perfect size when it started, it had nowhere to grow. And that's more or less what happened to them. The M62s came on the market, people found a way to package those, and the M62 had superior drivability because it didn't have the same amount of drag on it. It had much better power capabilities, and so the M45 simply fell out of production because of that. It was great in 1990. It was the solution, but better solutions came along. and the Miata literally outgrew it. So that's what happened to the M45. Do you have any more questions over there, Travis?
Not that I think that we can discuss in the video. There's a couple we may have to go back in and read the conversation going on to answer any comments.
Yeah, we will answer any questions you put in the comments on this video, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook. We will do our best to answer all of those. The more super nerdy technical ones, we'll do our best to answer some of those. The best turbo for a K24 time attack car, I'm not sure we can really go there because I don't think we have that level of very specific, very, very specific knowledge. But we'll certainly do our best to answer everything we can. There's one question here about the manifolds. Is there a performance difference between 2.5-inch and 3-inch downpipes on the Turbo NA8? And I'm going to make this more of a generic thing and talk about why that's the thing. So that's referring to basically the downpipe, the pipe that comes from the turbo down to the exhaust system. This is the downpipe off this car. This is a BBR setup for an ND. And turbos live and die by drag pressure. Again, like we've been talking about so much, it's about pressure differentials. You want high pressure here, low pressure here. So if you can get rid of any restriction in the downpipe, you'll get better response to your turbo, you get more power in your turbo, you have less back pressure, you'll be able to run more timing. It's all good. It's like this virtuous cycle. So yes, we have seen the 3-inch downpipe. Our standard FM2 or FM exhaust come with a 2.5. The 3-inch did open up some power. It did open up some spool. The turbo came up to full boost faster. It was good all the way around. The downside is if you're trying to limit your boost, you can get to the point where the wastegate can't dump enough back pressure. You can't dump enough energy to keep the boost down. So you could actually have trouble with overboosting with too low a restriction in the exhaust. There's ways around that, but that's why we don't recommend on our booty kits, for example. You just get beyond the ability of our GT2560 built-in wastegate to keep up with the boost level, or to keep up with the potential boost. So that's the potential downside. Packaging is a little more difficult too, but generally speaking, the less restriction you have, the better it works. And we do actually have dyno charts that show exactly how much extra power you can make off a 3-inch. Programming after installation. This is a pretty good one. With the emissions legal kits, there's no programming to be done after installation. And that is actually by requirement. The last thing the EPA and the ARB want to see is someone in there setting things up themselves, because if you can set it right, you can set it wrong. So all of our emissions legal stuff is plug and play. You cannot adjust the settings in the Buddha box. You cannot reprogram the settings in the ND. You load in a tune that is provided to you that is approved by the ARB, and then that is what it is. So the nice thing about the emissions legal stuff is it makes for a much easier installation because you can't mess with stuff. If it can't be user adjusted, it can't be user misadjusted. I think that's the way you would look at that. The ND2 and the 2019, that's a big question. People always want to know, why can't I put a turbo on my ND2 or a supercharger? Supercharger, the biggest problem with that is that the ND2 has different intake ports. I know there's an NC, but I'm going to point it anyway. So a new casting would be required here. On the turbo side of things, the exhaust ports are close enough. We can actually bolt one of these turbos on. The downside is the engine management. Completely different ECU. Nobody has cracked it to the point where we can run forced induction on it yet. There's some lightweight tuning being done to allow for a little more naturally aspirated power. It's not enough to allow us to do something like ram 8 pounds of boost down the poor thing's throat. So we don't know what power output of those things will be. Probably will be quite a bit of fun. We don't know when that will be available. It's the most popular question we have about forced induction. When will we have an ND2 turbo or supercharger? And the question is, we don't do the cracking of the ECUs ourselves, so unfortunately we're at the limit, or at the mercy of some other folks who are doing that. EcuTech is not prioritizing ND2. So for the time being, if you want boost, you want an ND1. That's unfortunately the way it goes. That ND2 engine is a huge amount of fun, naturally aspirated, but it simply is not boost friendly at the moment because of the ECU. Hopefully, if you are viewing this in the future people enjoy your boosted ND2s, but for those of us stuck here in 2020, we don't have it at the moment. A lot of stuff we don't have in 2020. We can't go outside. Okay. But yeah, we also don't have boost for our ND2s.
I get a couple of quick questions if you want to hit them real fast. How do we feel about alternative engine management such as the MS3 Pro for our turbo kits?
we have no problem with you running alternative engine management with your turbo kit. If you want to push past the capabilities of a stage 1 turbo, you do need to go with alternative engine management. That is the limitation of the stage 1 turbos, is that basically, the turbo can manage 250 horsepower, but we're limiting it to 160, 180, 200, depending on the model year, simply because the fuel delivery isn't there. So yes, definitely go with, if you want to push further than that, be aware that you may not be able to pass emissions. Be aware that federally it's actually illegal. One of the reasons we don't sell them anymore, because there have been crackdowns on that sort of thing, not on individuals. But you will want to make sure you buy your engine management from a shop with very good support. I think that's more important than the fundamental engine management you choose. It's who stands behind it. Our friends at DIY Auto Tune, for example, very good at standing behind their stuff. So if you do pick up an MS3 from them, for example, there's a very good chance it'll be set up well with their help. So no matter what you end up using, whether it's a 221 from ME, whether it's an MS3, whether it's some of the others, Autronic that are coming out, that sort of thing. There's also Speedino, all sorts of stuff like that. Make sure you've either got the experience or you've got the support. If you don't have either one of those, you're in for a world of hurt. Knowing a bunch of guys in a forum, not always the same as experience or support. I think you get more benefit out of one guy who has seen 100 different cars than 100 guys who have seen one car. But that is the nature of DIY stuff, isn't it? So yeah, definitely. If you want to push past the limits imposed by the stock ECU, you will have to go with some sort of alternative engine management to do it safely and do it well. You do zoom in on this thing because these are so cool looking. I just love the look of the turbine. Woo! Although it's a compressor. Whatever. And there's all sorts of stuff I can talk about with turbochargers in terms of what an AR ratio is and that sort of thing, but this is the fundamentals. Do we have more questions there, Travis?
An opinion.
An opinion. I'm sure there's opinions out there.
What do you think your favorite horsepower level on a street car is? On a street Miata?
Well, I'm standing beside a street Miata that's got 466 horsepower at the wheels, so...
Loaded question.
It's a fun question. I'm a response monster, honestly. I love quick response. The nice thing about this thing is it's got 11-to-1 compression. It's got crazy response. Even if you're not using all the horsepower, you've got it there. My normal street Miata, it's got an interior and air conditioning and a radio and all the mod cons. This one doesn't. Is a small turbocharger. It's a 1.8 with a 2554. The actual peak power is not as critical to me as the response, as the way it behaves. So I've got that thing set up to have a lot of response throughout the rev range. It's very linear. It's very easy to drive. So that's my power level. It doesn't have a number on it. It's more about the way it behaves. It might sound like I'm dodging the question, but it's not. I'm standing in here in a garage. It's got one car that's got 80 horsepower. One car that's got 466. And I enjoy driving both of them. So yeah, call it a dodge if you will, but it's about the nature of the power delivery that I enjoy, not the bulk amount. But 466, I can recommend it. It's fun, as long as you don't have to deal with a turbo this big to deal with it. You don't want to light the fuse, throw it over the wall, and then wait for a while. I'm just looking at the lists here. Lots of questions about ND transmissions. You want to know what the ultimate fix for the ND transmission is? It's put in an NC transmission. And you know who just released this week, about that, the BBR kit to allow you to put an NC transmission in your ND? That will be Flyin Miata. We have them on the shelf. You can get rid of your ND transmission problems, go back to the stronger transmission used in the NC. We have those things on the shelf. It's a fairly easy installation. The power plant frame doesn't need modification, and that will solve your ND transmission problem. So, there's your answer. Mostly what it will take to take a Miata to 350 rear wheel horsepower, engine work. You're gonna be inside the engine for that one, and a big enough turbo, and good engine management, and good tuning.
Or V8. Or V8.
Or V8. You can keep a V8 down to 350. It takes a bit of work, but you can limit it to that level if you want to. If you want more than 350, I think that if you're looking at 400 or more, the V8 is the way to go. If you're looking at 250, running, say an FM turbo on a stock ECU or stock internals is the way to go. It's that awkward 250 to 400 range where you have to spend a lot of money. You don't get quite the same level that you do out of the V8 cars. you're starting to put things like transmissions at risk, you're putting rear ends at risk, your cooling system's getting more and more overtaxed. It's an awkward place to try to live. So if you're trying to get 350, ask yourself exactly why it is you're looking at 350 specifically, and why not, go all the way, go to a VA. Why not say, well, 250 actually will do me just fine. The reason I want a 350 is because I read on the internet that everyone has 250. Figure out why it is that that's the power number you're looking for, and is it worth the pain? Because it's an awkward middle ground. Yeah. What's the best turbo size for making boost at most RPMs? Small one, I guess. I think the question there is all about area under the curve. You want as much dyno chart. You want as much low end, as much and high end combined. On the stock 1.8s, honestly, the 2560 that we use in our turbo kits is chosen for that reason. It's a really good all-round turbo. You want to make 400 horsepower, it's not the turbo for you, but you're also going to give up some response with that big one. And again, Jeremy's at home going, oh my god, because he drives to work in a 450 horsepower Miata with a 3071 stuck on the side of it. But it does feel laggy because the top end is completely bonkers, bottom end feels dead. Anyway, Travis is laughing at me over there. We have a question.
Some guy named Eric Anderson wants to know what color that Miata is supposed to be.
Eric Anderson. Mr. Anderson. Yeah, this, those of you who don't know, this is Igor. This is Travis's personal Miata. It's not his first. May not be his last, but it is current. And this car actually, now we're getting away from the whole turbo thing, but this is a prime example of what happens if you take a $1,000 car and put $10,000 worth of parts in it. You end up with a very fast, very fun $11,000 car. This was actually a salvage car that came to Flyin Miata, and it was too good to take apart. It had some body damage, little bits and stuff like that, but it wasn't a salvage title, and so we put a turbo on it, we put a 3-inch exhaust, we put suspension on it, and it was a demonstrator for Flyin Miata for about a decade, I think. And now, it had run its course. It was we were moving on to another car for R&D work. And so we sold it to Travis, and Travis has made Igor prettier than Igor has ever been. But the one thing he hasn't changed about Igor yet is that Igor is made up of bits and pieces of multiple cars. This fender is black, this fender is blue, that door is green, that hardtop is blue, and this, of course, is a 2005 Mazda Speed lava orange. We had one come in and it hit the side, so it's got basically a lava orange stripe throughout the middle of the car. So yes, poor little Igor. Anyway, I know that Derek was being a smartass, but that's okay, because it lets us tell the story of Igor, which is one of Flyin Miata's longest-serving R&D cars. Good little car. Igor. Any more questions? That was it. We answered everything the internet wants to know about Turbocharger.
No, there's just a few complicated ones that we're going to have to answer later.
There are forums. There's some, I forget what it's called, but some forum is devoted to turbocharging on Miatas. It's got something to do with cats. But yeah, there are lots of people out there who love getting into the nitty-gritty, the little fine-tuned details. The purpose of this video was, of course, to talk about, give people the fundamental answers they needed in order to be able to read those forum posts with a certain amount of understanding, to get them started at least on their forced induction journey. Blown head gasket, blue smoke coming from exhaust, ticking noise is pretty bad. It's stuck valve springs. I do a little work on that car before I put a turbo on it. Blue smoke, that's a bad sign. Like we said, oil is very low, very, very low octane, so it's a problem. There is one question here about our FM carb legal turbo kit. Will it pass California emissions due to pre-cat on a 1999 NB? So, the 99 2000 NBs came in two different versions. There was the 49 state version, the federal version, and the California version. The California version had an extra catalytic converter in the downpipe, or sort of stuck on the side of the intake the exhaust manifold. It was an ugly little thing. REO allows us to build a turbo for that, but we don't have one at the moment for that specific car, the 2-cat car. If you have a federal car that has been imported into California, then from my understanding of California emissions regulations and the way the EO is written, that would be legal. If you have a car that has been legally imported into California and was a 1-cat car from the factory and the stickers under the hood refer to the 1-cats and everything like that, then you can put our turbo kit on. 2-cats cars, we don't have a solution for you yet. It's on our R&D list. Our R&D guys are... we got 4 generations of cars to look after here. R&D guys are busy, and we're hoping to get to that one eventually, but at the moment we do not, unfortunately, have a complete legal bolt-on kit. it would fail a visual if the small ref was to look at it and realize it was supposed to have two cats. Otherwise, it would look just like this. It would look like a one cat, a federal car. That's all I'm going to say about that. Do we have more questions over there, or are they all the sort of super nerdy ones? Okay, well, I have bored you guys long enough. I've talked longer about turbos than I talk about V8 NDs. So if you have questions, stick them in the comments. Like I said, we'll answer them as best we can. Future people, current people, whoever you are. And we'll be back next week with a little more information. I'll probably have a new product to show you. Thank you for your attention. Again, my name is Keith Tanner from Flyin Miata, and enjoy your boost.